Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on quite a fascinating exploration. Conservatism,
It's a big one.
definitely. And for you, our listener, keen to grasp complex topics pretty efficiently, we've gathered a really rich collection of sources.
Yeah. Everything from chats with the philosopher Roger Scruton, explanations of the philosophy itself, some psychological research.
Right, into political leanings, and even some sort of modern visions for its future.
Our mission is, well, pretty straightforward. Pull out the most crucial insights about conservatism from all this material.
Exactly. Give you multiple perspectives, but importantly, without getting drawn into taking sides.
Consider this your shortcut to a hopefully well-informed understanding of what can be a pretty significant and, let's face it, often debated ideology.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Unpack the foundation.
Right. So one of our sources points out that fundamentally conservatism centers on a commitment to traditional values and institutions.
Traditional values.
Think of it as, generally favoring established ways. This often translates into support for free enterprise, private ownership.
Well, socially conservative ideas, usually.
Yes, but it's really crucial to acknowledge, as the same source notes, that conservatism itself is a loaded term. It can provoke strong reactions, often quite opposing ones.
Absolutely. And it feels easy to slip into thinking of it as just negative, doesn't it? Like just resistance to change, maybe rooted in what one source called irrational
Well,
prejudice.
common misconception, yeah. But the sources we looked at show a much deeper, more nuanced history and, well, a set of core principles.
So to really get it, we probably need to go back to some of the key thinkers.
Precisely. You really have to look at the intellectual roots. Often people trace modern conservatism back to Edmund Burke, the 18th century philosopher.
Ah, Burke, famous for his critique of the French Revolution, right?
Exactly. He really emphasized the immense, often unspoken wisdom embedded in traditions and institutions that are evolved over time.
So like the stuff that's worked for ages.
Sort of. His key insight was that just tossing aside this accumulated wisdom bank for brand new, untested, abstract theories, well, that carries huge risks.
A lesson still relevant today, you could argue.
Fiercely debated, definitely. He argued for incremental, evolutionary change over radical revolutionary upheaval.
So slow and steady wins the race in a societal sense, rather than a massive, potentially disruptive overhaul based on some blueprint.
That's a good way to put it. One source highlights Burke's deep suspicion of abstract philosophical ideas just being imposed on the messy reality of society.
Like he was saying, hang on, society isn't a lab experiment.
Exactly that. This skepticism towards abstract theory that's disconnected from practical experience, that's a real hallmark.
Okay, so that's the historical root. What about the core beliefs that tend to define conservative thought today?
Well, several themes keep popping up in the sources. One is this view of society as primarily a collection of individuals.
Individuals, not like one big collective entity.
Right. Rather than a single thing with its own unified will. And this individual focus, one source explains, often shapes conservative views on things like crime.
How so?
Well, responsibility tends to be placed more on individual choices and actions rather than solely blaming broader societal factors.
Okay, that tracks logically. If the individual is the main actor, then personal accountability becomes central. What else?
Several other things. There's often a belief in a transcendent moral order.
Meaning?
The idea that there are objective rights and wrongs out there, independent of what people just happen to think at the time.
Okay.
And a strong emphasis on social continuity, learning from the past, both successes and failures. Another key concept is prescription.
Prescription, like a doctor's note.
Not quite. Think of it more like the accumulated wisdom and practices passed down through generations. The idea is that time-tested ways of doing things probably have value, even if we don't immediately see why.
Got it. Inherited wisdom.
Yes. Then there's prudence, being careful, considering long-term consequences. And finally, often an acceptance that, variety and even some inequality are kind of natural in a complex society.
And we shouldn't forget that quite grounded perspective mentioned by a couple of sources, that conservatives tend to be realistic about human nature.
Acknowledging imperfection, right?
Yeah, and therefore being pretty skeptical about achieving some perfect utopia. It's a more maybe sober view of what's possible.
It is. And what's really interesting is when you start looking at how this philosophy connects with the psychological side of
Ah,
things.
the psychology of conservatism.
Yeah.
Sources like Seeker and BD Design Co. looked into this.
They did. Research suggests some correlation between conservative leanings and certain personality traits, notably higher conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness, meaning orderly, disciplined.
Exactly. Orderly, hardworking, vigilant, that sort of thing.
Okay, here's where it gets maybe even more fascinating. One source, Seeker, talked about this idea of an implicit negativity bias,
Right. Often observed in individuals leaning conservative.
meaning they tend to notice and react more quickly to potential threats. They mentioned eye tracking studies providing evidence for this.
Yes, and the proposed evolutionary explanation for that is pretty compelling.
Survival advantage.
Basically, yeah. A heightened sensitivity to danger would have helped our ancestors survive by reacting faster to real threats.
And this caution towards perceived threats, the video suggested, might resonate with certain conservative policy positions.
It could. Things like a strong national defense or maybe a more cautious approach to immigration, for example.
It's also worth mentioning the research by Dr. John Jost, also referenced there. It took a while to gain acceptance, apparently.
It did initially stir debate, yes. But his work suggests conservatives often show a stronger need for certainty and less tolerance for ambiguity.
Okay, that's a key point. But the source rightly stressed something important here.
Absolutely. Identifying these psychological tendencies shouldn't lead to just dismissing or stereotyping whole groups of people.
Right, the value is in understanding potential inclinations, not using them as a weapon.
Precisely. It's about understanding, not division.
Now, of course, no broad philosophy goes without criticism, and conservatism is definitely no different.
Fair point.
One source pointed out that inherent tension between valuing tradition and the fact that sometimes society really needs to change, maybe even radically.
Like the examples they gave,
Yeah.
like the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement.
Exactly. Instances where radical action seemed necessary to fix deep injustices that were, ironically, rooted in tradition itself.
That really raises a fundamental question for conservative thought, doesn't it? How does a philosophy prizing the past deal with times when the past is the problem?
Our sources touch on this. Like, Hip Hughes suggested some conservatives, maybe particularly social conservatives, can be wary of intellectualism.
Afraid that new ideas might erode cherished value.
Yeah, or maybe lead to bigger government. And then there's the philosopher Roger Scruton.
Ah, yes. Philosophy Insights highlighted his concerns.
He worried that modern conservatism had become too focused on just free market economics.
Right, potentially neglecting core moral and spiritual values. He argued that letting economic language dominate everything else risks undermining the whole conservative project.
Which he felt needed those moral dimensions to be healthy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's really insightful about Scruton, though, is how he described becoming a conservative himself.
It wasn't an intellectual thing.
Not primarily, no. He said it wasn't like converting to some neat system. He associated that more with leftist ideologies. For him, it was more like returning to an intuitive, almost gut feeling about what feels right, what sustains a community.
That's interesting. He even quipped, didn't he, that an intellectual conservative explains the reasons for not having reasons, but just feeling and doing what feels right based on ingrained wisdom.
He did. It's a really provocative idea. It challenges that stereotype of conservatism as purely rationalistic or maybe even anti-intellectual sometimes.
Okay, so that kind of complexity brings us to Jordan Peterson's Conservative Manifesto.
Which seems like an attempt to outline a more positive, forward-looking vision.
Right. Peterson starts by saying he sees a big crisis of meaning in the West.
A profound one, yeah. And his manifesto then emphasizes things like tradition, community, individual responsibility, especially when things get tough.
He lays out a set of key values he thinks we need to rediscover, doesn't he?
He does. It's quite a list.
Mm-hmm.
Humility, liberty, autonomy, truth, agency, identity, merit, responsibility, tradition, community, stewardship, justice, and unity.
And he gives them specific meanings, like humility isn't about putting yourself down, but accepting you don't know everything.
Exactly. Accepting the limits of current knowledge, and truth as a process, not a fixed state. He also stresses balancing individual freedom with community responsibility.
So Peterson's work seems like an effort to move beyond just reacting against things and offer a more positive framework for conservative ideas today.
I think that's a fair reading. Now, shifting gears a bit, Greg Gutfeld offers a more, shall we say, down-to-earth take.
Yeah, the PragerU piece presents his view. Gutfeld argues conservatism is fundamentally practical, even generous and compassionate.
Practical how?
He portrays conservatives as generally risk-averse, valuing caution, tradition, focusing on fixing what you can fix, and accepting limits.
Okay, a focus on the achievable.
He even uses that quite vivid analogy, conservatives as the cleanup crew.
Ah, right. Coming in after periods of more liberal risk-taking or social experimentation.
And he emphasizes those long-term values often linked with conservatism, marriage, family, religion.
It makes that interesting argument that, in a way, conservative stability actually enables liberalism to function.
That is fascinating, isn't it? Maybe counterintuitive. The idea that innovation needs an anchor.
It's a thought-provoking perspective. Finally, Dr. Jordan B. Cooper gives us a helpful rundown of classical conservatism.
Right. He emphasizes it's less a rigid ideology, more a kind of temperament.
A disposition, yeah, pointing to figures like Burke, Russell Kirk, and Scruton again.
And he boils it down to 5 core points.
Basically, yes. First, reform over revolution, gradual improvement, not radical overthrow. Second, valuing inheritance culture, customs, institutions.
Okay.
Third, the inevitability of hierarchy, natural social ordering, which he clarifies doesn't automatically mean oppression. Fourth, a belief in universal human nature and natural law, inherent human traits, and transcendent moral principles.
And fifth,
Realism, rejecting utopian dreams, focusing on practical solutions given human limitations.
so wrapping up this deep dive, it's just crystal clear that conservatism isn't one single thing. It's complex, it evolves.
Absolutely. It has deep historical roots, philosophical layers, psychological links, different practical ways it shows up.
It covers a whole spectrum of views on society, change, human nature, the role of tradition,
Yeah.
all of it.
And we really hope this exploration has given you, our listener, a richer, more nuanced picture of these important ideas, hopefully some aha moments without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Definitely. And now, maybe a final thought for you to mull over.
Yeah.
Considering all these diverse perspectives we've touched on,
From cautious pragmatism to a focus on moral order.
from psychological insights to different visions for the future, what specific parts of conservative thought, if any, resonate most with you?
And maybe how do those ideas connect to the challenges and the opportunities that society's facing right now?
That's certainly something worth reflecting on further.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Are we all so